B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, September 20th, 2019. Worldwide, led by young people, student activists. There are marches and protests demanding action on climate change. And I decided not to strike today because, well, I've got too much news to comment on. The big story swirling in Washington relates to the leaks from the intelligence community earlier this week, the battle over whistleblower claims between Congress and the Republicans led by Trump. And we've seen some really bad journalism this week, as media outlets once again lean on anonymous sources in the intelligence community. The revelations were originally attributed to two former intelligence officials, and the leaks just keep on coming. So there was this bizarre news conference today where Trump was doing a photo op with the Prime Minister of Australia, but he answered a lot of questions from the media about this. We'll get to his comments in a moment. But the latest in the drip, drip, drip of the leaking is that despite the corporate media speculation driven by Rachel Maddow, the phone call in question that was intercepted and is the basis of the whistleblower's complaint was not with Putin. It was with the newly elected president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, there does appear to be controversy. Trump, of course, is trying to sidestep it because what we are learning is that this is related to other news accounts that we've seen and the feverish efforts of that cartoonish clown who works for Trump pro bono so he can reduce his exposure in his divorce case, Rudy 9/11 Giuliani. And I'm thinking of the song by Stealers Wheel. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Because this is a cartoon saga. Now, I acknowledge there is something behind it. The efforts by Trump and Giuliani to pressure the government of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. And as I've talked about many times, there is something worth investigating there. But to use the levers of power to withhold congressionally approved funding for Ukraine, to increase that leverage, that could be a very serious issue. But the way this has been handled, and again, the use of anonymous leaks to drive a media narrative, it just makes me shake my head. So we now know that it centers around Ukraine. The phone call was on July 25th. The complaint was filed on August 12th. And what was bizarre is that last night on CNN, Chris Cuomo gave Rudy Giuliani plenty of time. And Giuliani first denied that there was any effort to pressure Ukraine to get the Bidens, and then he gleefully admitted it. And despite that, in the White House presser today, Trump said he didn't know this about Ukraine. He doesn't know who the whistleblower was, but it's clearly a partisan. He knows that. And so we have irrational behavior, incoherent commentary on both sides of this bizarre story. And here's Giuliani to the New York Times. We're not meddling in an election. We're meddling in an investigation, which we have a right to do. There's nothing illegal about it. Somebody could say it's improper. I'm asking them to do an investigation that they're doing already, and other people are telling them to stop. Now, up to the point where Giuliani presses the issue about Biden and Ukraine, there is something there that deserves investigation. We know that the Trump administration held back the $250 million that had been approved for Ukraine. And then when they shifted money to pay for the fantasy wall on the southern border, they took almost all the money that had been appropriated for strengthening defenses along the NATO line. And so it just gets more and more weird. Now, the government of Ukraine released a brief 6-paragraph summary of the phone call between Zelensky and Trump. In paragraph 2, they say Donald Trump is convinced that the new Ukrainian government will be able to quickly improve image of Ukraine, complete investigation of corruption cases which inhibited the interaction between Ukraine and the USA. Now, that vague reference, inhibited the interaction between Ukraine and the USA, this could be where Trump made some sort of a promise. That's the other little tidbit that's been leaked. He made a promise that the whistleblower felt was egregiously inappropriate. Maybe he promised to do something bad to Ukraine. Maybe he promised to reward them in some way if they brought him the scalp of Hunter Biden. So the Washington Post published a transcript today of the Chris Cuomo exchange. It's hard to call it an interview with Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani was unhinged. It's like he'd had 8 cups of coffee. And again, the issues related to Ukraine, even though I don't support the methods that Giuliani has used to try to explore it himself, he undercut his own comments by accusing Chris Cuomo thusly. He said, "You've also covered up the fact that Biden and his son took $1.5 billion out of China." What the hell is that about? This is totally untethered. There is no narrative, even in in partisan media or in unreliable single-source media. I have not heard anything related to this claim. I've heard a lot about Ukraine. So this is where Giuliani goes off and turns himself into Goofy. And here's an exchange between Cuomo and Giuliani. Cuomo: "This raises the question, why were you investigating this? Why did you back away from the trip in May to Ukraine?" "Because I was told." Cuomo again: "Why did you wind up meeting in Spain instead of Ukraine?" Well, they rhyme. Giuliani: "Because I was told that the people at the meeting with the president were people who work for George Soros. And George Soros had been funding this whole thing from the very, very beginning. Not only that, that was corroborated." Cuomo: "That's why you backed away?" Giuliani: "Yes, because they were going to lie about the conversation I was having with the president." Giuliani: "Oh, I absolutely do. I have proof." Cuomo: "How so?" "Okay, George Soros had a non-for-profit called ANTAC. ANTAC is the one that developed all of the dirty information that ended up being a false document that was created in order to incriminate Manafort." Manafort? Haven't the Republicans written him off? It's hard to imagine that Manafort was framed. Manafort brought on his own corruption and was caught and squeezed by the Mueller investigation. So now to Trump's comments in the White House today, certainly making the Prime Minister of Australia squirm. So Trump dismissed a whistleblower complaint said to involve him as a partisan attack, but acknowledged that he doesn't know the identity of the person who lodged it. In the voice of the New York Times, details of the complaint remain murky, but the allegations deal at least in part with Ukraine. 2 people familiar with it have said that's a leak. That revelation immediately increased scrutiny on Trump's public push for the country's new government to investigate Biden and whether it was related to the White House hold this summer on a military aid package for Ukraine that has since been released. Trump was playing defense. said that it dealt in part with an unspecified commitment that he made to an unnamed foreign leader. Trump also said that he did not know the leader in question. Now, how is that? If Giuliani's on TV Thursday night blabbing about Ukraine, and Friday morning Trump doesn't know that the intercepted call that the whistleblower complained about is Ukraine, I think that is a fake denial. Trump derided the complaint as a ridiculous story, said his communications with other leaders were at the highest level, always appropriate. And then he waved away a question about whether Trump had talked to Zelensky about Biden in the July phone call. He waved away the question but said, someone ought to look into Joe Biden. Nancy Pelosi, in high harumph, offered the acting director of National Intelligence, McGuire, and Trump a sharp warning, saying in a statement she believed the acting director is violating the law by refusing to disclose the complaint to Congress. If the president has done what has been alleged, then he is stepping into a dangerous minefield with serious repercussions for his administration and our democracy. The antidote, Nancy, is impeachment. Please. So I believe that the media has really performed badly this week. And Exhibit A, I read online last night and was surprised when it appeared on the front page of the print edition of today's New York Times. In the print, the headline reads, American vow to defend Gulf is facing a test. Hesitation to act may embolden Tehran. Now, I posted on Facebook that this is neocon hawk guano. That's bird shit, hawk shit. That's what I'm saying. This is a parade of would-be John Boltons who are quoted by the New York Times in an effort to make Trump look weak, to suggest that his failure to already have attacked Iran is going to be exploited by Tehran. This is the kind of coverage that rushed us into war in Iraq in 2003 and blithely allowed, with little critical comment, the war in Syria, the takedown of Gaddafi in Libya, and the ongoing misadventure in Yemen. And this work by the Times is really offensive because it suggests that we all know that Iran did this, even as it admits in paragraph 16 here, Iranian leaders have denied responsibility for the attack. They quote Arab Gulf states who claim they believe that the United States has agreed to protect them. And the lead paragraph of this article reads, the oil-rich monarchies of the Persian Gulf have relied for decades on the promise of protection by the United States military, a commitment sealed by the rollback of the 1990 invasion of Kuwait and reinforced by a half-dozen American military bases that sprang up around the region. That is not a commitment. That is imperialism. And the fact that George H.W. Bush allowed Saddam to invade Kuwait and then went in and kicked him out, despite the fact that we had no obligation to defend Kuwait, may have set a precedent in certain people's minds, but there is no treaty obligation for the United States to defend the Saudis or to fight a war on their behalf as some sort of a proxy. So my full comment on Facebook was, today's example of this is not journalism. It's neocon hawk guano. There is no U.S. treaty or other agreement to defend Saudi Arabia. The article quotes a parade of Boltons who say Trump is weak for not already taking military action. It ignores previous use of drones and cruise missiles by the Houthis and the bigger picture of the brutal MBS war on Yemen. If Trump wants to stop future attacks, he'd tell MBS to end the war. And here's a little yellow journalism creeping into the coverage of The Guardian. Saudi Arabia has not identified the precise point from which the attack was launched, but unnamed U.S. intelligence sources claim it was southern Iran. And the attack was undertaken with the knowledge of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Now, wait a minute. Here they are taking a leak from intelligence about where the attack came from and then upping the ante and saying the Ayatollah knew about it. They offer no evidence, no source for that claim. Now, the Times did get it right in one story that was buried deep in the paper today. Headline reads, "Strike on oil facilities highlights shortcomings of kingdom's military." And despite all the high-tech military weapons that the U.S. has sold to the Saudis, it says their military has often been unable to act effectively, reinforcing a view among national security officials and humanitarian activists that despite all that hardware, Saudi Arabia remains uninterested or incapable of defending its entire territory or competently and humanely prosecuting a war abroad. Now, listen to that last line there, competently and humanely prosecuting the Yemen war. As if there is some humane basis, or that competence in killing all those civilians and starving them to death would somehow make it better. I digress. Anyway, yesterday I told you about how my dad taught me about the Maginot Line. That was the line of defense that France erected after World War I. And when Hitler wanted to take out the Maginot Line, he simply sent the Luftwaffe in behind because they didn't set up the gun turrets to go 360. And it's similar in Saudi, where the Patriot missiles, which are not that effective, but they're not even at these oil installations. They're at military command posts. And get this, 4 American military officers, who don't get named, say that the Saudi military doesn't have the same kind of enlisted personnel corps that forms the backbone of the American military. Yeah, it is mostly mercenaries, contract killers. They also say many officers rise because of patronage and connections to the Saudi royal family. And so we are propping up a dictatorship that beheads people, that executed Khashoggi at their consulate in Istanbul, and that isn't prepared to fight, even to protect themselves from the blowback of the war that they're waging against Yemen. And somehow this becomes our implicit responsibility with no treaty obligations, and here's the New York Times manufacturing consent for a future war on the front page of today's paper. You can tell I don't like it. Meanwhile, we've got a tally of the election in Israel this week. The Blue and White Party with candidate Benny Gantz drew 33 seats in the Knesset, and Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud only 31. Now, Reuven Rivlin is the president of Israel, and apparently he has the latitude to pick either party to try to form a government, give them 28 days with an extra 14 if they need it. Netanyahu is a Mr. Desperado. He is trying to force Benny Gantz to submit, even though Gantz has this limited margin in his favor. And that's, of course, because Benjamin Netanyahu is facing criminal charges for corruption, and he is desperate to hold on to that job for that reason. And Rex Tillerson made a couple of honest comments yesterday in a talk at Harvard. He said that Israeli officials played Trump, warning that a healthy amount of skepticism is needed in dealings with Benjamin Netanyahu. They did that with the president on a couple occasions to persuade him that we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, Tillerson said. We later exposed it to the president so he understood you've been played. That's fairly vague. But he also called Netanyahu a bit Machiavellian, which led Bibi to tweet back, Secretary Tillerson, Israel is the good guy. Yeah, right. Now, we have free speech rights in this country, correct? Except if you criticize Israel or the official narrative of 9/11. Exhibit A. The Women's March just purged its board of people who were viewed as favoring Minister Farrakhan. unwilling to denounce anti-Semitism. And one of the people who was on the revised board was just booted yesterday, Zahra Balloo, who's from here in the Bay Area. She heads a chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. And she has in the past made fiery comments and tweets, including calling Israel an apartheid state. I defend her right to free speech, but the Anti-Defamation League is gunning for her, and they were successful. Her comment? This new board has said that you can be a Muslim and an advocate for human rights if it is convenient, if it is comfortable, and if it feels safe. Second item in this vein, the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos and her sidekick Ken Marcus, they are interfering in curriculum at certain universities to purge it of criticism of Israel. They said that a joint project between Duke and North Carolina at Chapel Hill did not present enough positive imagery of Judaism and Christianity in the region. Well, first, they silenced the supporters of BDS, and now they are trying to force universities to promote propaganda about the State of Israel. And here's the final case of incursion on First Amendment rights. I've told you that I think Marianne Williamson has made some interesting comments and contributions to the Democratic primary debates. She does not have a prayer of becoming the nominee. And yet CNN, the gatekeeper of official truth, has attacked her because back in 2012, she went on a podcast with Kevin Barrett, one of those dangerous 9/11 truthers. Now, Barrett makes comments that are much more incendiary than I do, but we share skepticism, rejection of the official version of 9/11, and the idea that Marianne Williamson might have some of those same questions has to be scrubbed. And CNN decided to take on that task today. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And today, I want to single out a few people like Andrew Harnack, Polina Vasilev, Jason Ferguson, and Peter Hoffmeister. Each of them contributes $5 a month. You can do that. Sure you can. All you got to do is visit my website at peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber, you hit the sign-up page, and you choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And should you prefer to communicate by the U.S. mail, do so. I'm at Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, today is the day, as I mentioned at the top, that worldwide people led by young activists are taking to the streets, taking the day off work, calling it a strike, and demanding climate action now. Now, I support this, and I think that it is, past time to demand action and attention on these issues. In Houston, hundreds of people were out in the streets a day after Tropical Storm Imelda flooded Houston for the third time in 3 years, I think it is, and these are considered 500-year floods, 3 in a row. It is time to end the denial, and a lot of it sits in our government. David Swanson has emailed that there are peace groups that are joining climate action in Washington today to draw attention to the fact that the U.S. military is one of the biggest polluters on Earth. And since 2001, the U.S. military has emitted 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases, equivalent to the annual emissions of 257 million cars on the road. And it's true, the U.S. military is a really awful steward of the planet. Also, we're seeing extra coverage of climate issues in a coordinated media effort right now, drawing attention to the decline of wild bird species in the United States. It has dropped by nearly 3 billion in the last 50 years. Amazon is caving into pressure, responding, I guess the better way to put it, and announcing that they will buy 100,000 electric vans for their deliveries and they plan to have 100% of its energy use from renewables by 2030. I do see corporate entities as one pressure point to force more government action. And my colleague Jeff Schechtman, who produces podcasts for Who, What, Why, like I do, he has a conversation with climate change pioneer Bill McKibben available to you. I've linked to that podcast in the show file for today's news and comment show. I'm also releasing to my subscribers today my latest Who, What, Why podcast, where I talked with Mark Carlin of BuzzFlash and Russ Baker, the editor of Who, What, Why. And they take on my challenge to pressure Twitter to either discipline Trump or suspend or delete his account because of his repeated violations of their standards of conduct. Here's an excerpt from that podcast, and it's Russ Baker of Who, What, Why. Elon Musk has been instructed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is the founder of Tesla and the Boring Company and the other interests that he has. He has been told that he has to vet his tweets that could cause any movement in Tesla stock before he actually pushes send. So do we need adult supervision for Trump before he takes to Twitter?
Well, it's interesting that we have those rules and regulations for the fundamental mechanisms of capitalism, if you consider that to be Wall Street, but we don't have it for the way in which someone like Trump can also affect the markets and everything else, which he's doing as well. I mean, that would be another point, would be to ask them about the comments that he makes and how they affect shares, because they do. And by the way, of course, the other thing he does, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is he deliberately throws these things out right when we ought to be paying attention to something like the economy, and the media eats it up and turns in that direction. So, yeah, I think there ought to be a lot more pressure on Twitter to acknowledge the power and the impact and the role that it plays, and that it ought to start moving in the direction, at least step by step, to hold them accountable. Absolutely.
My latest podcast about Twitter available today to my subscribers at peterbcollins.com. Tune in, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher. Well, Trump got one thing right. The New York Times has calculated that it's costing $13 million per prisoner per year to keep open the gulag at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Of course, he blamed Obama for not closing the camp. He's not lifting a finger to do so, but, you know. Also, we are learning that in the military tribunals at Guantanamo, it is still out of bounds to refer to torture of some of the defendants. This happened in an exchange between a lawyer who represents the guy who was described as the paymaster for the 9/11 accused and the role that the FBI played. We are learning that the FBI continued to participate in the torture interrogations while claiming that it was above that and that Bob Mueller had pulled his people from that. Instead, they submitted questions to CIA torturers and used the answers. So in an exchange, the question came up, did Fitzgerald, who's one of the lawyers for the government, know when he sent in the question, oh, I see, Fitzgerald is an FBI agent who sent questions, did he know that the defendants would be tortured? Well, a prosecutor objected to that word, and the attorney changed his language. But in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in San Francisco, lawyers for a Guantanamo Bay prisoner, Abu Zubaydah, are permitted to use the term torture. The appeals court is ordering that Mitchell and Jessen, the two guys who were hired by the CIA, $80 million to design and implement the torture regimes, well, they are being ordered to answer questions from the lawyers of Abu Zubaydah. But the Court of Appeals said, to use colloquial terms, Abu Zubaydah was tortured. You may know that San Quentin Prison and the death chamber, where executions are currently suspended under Governor Newsom, is less than a mile from where I sit right now. And Beto O'Rourke who is not performing well in the presidential polls. He visited San Quentin just the other day, and I want to commend him. He said, "I'm running to be president of everyone in the U.S. I'm especially interested in listening to those who have never had a seat at the table, whose stories have never really been told." Well, good for you, Beto. He also visited some weed shops here in California where he announced a very aggressive plan, not only to end the drug war, but to give justice grants to people who were incarcerated for drug offenses. And he also wants to legalize banking for the weed industry. We're now seeing some polling after the most recent Democratic debate, and it's fascinating. I'm looking at a workup here from BuzzFeed where they show Elizabeth Warren on the ascent. Now, the numbers shifted only by 2 points. That's within the margin of error. She climbed from 28 to 30%, but the way they graphically display it, they make it look like she's going way up. They used a slightly lower angle to show the rise of Joe Biden, again within the margin of error from 23 to 24%, and then they use a descending line to show that Bernie Sanders moved from 15 to 14%. Again, a meaningless shift within the margin of error. But what is interesting is who the second choices are of various leading candidates. For Elizabeth Warren, 21% of her voters would choose Bernie Sanders as a second choice, but 21% would choose Pete Buttigieg, and 20% would choose Kamala Harris. Biden's second choice lineup: Warren 37%, Harris 14%, Buttigieg 10%, Sanders only 8%. Now, when you look at the Sanders campaign, his voters say that Elizabeth Warren is their second choice by 59%. Tulsi Gabbard places second at 11%. 8% is unsure, and only 5% of Sanders voters would hold their noses and vote for Joe Biden. And Bernie is trying to burnish his credentials in the labor movement. He went to Las Vegas to talk to the machinists, and he advocated federal laws to end right-to-work laws in individual states. As a former union officer in AFTRA, the American Federation of TV and Radio Artists, now merged with SAG, I often fought these right-to-work for less laws. Bernie has identified an important issue for working people in this country. And finally today, the New York Times takes a jaundiced eye to efforts by union activists, who they call a group of far-left activists, who are members of the Democratic Socialists of America. They're also union members who believe that their labor leaders have sold out to powerful political interests. So they held a meeting talking about ways to democratize their unions. And the unions have fought back. Oh, democracy can only go so far in the labor movement, and they're not interested. Today, I have a special feature for you as we wrap up the podcast. My good buddy Gary Chu is the official film reviewer of the Peter B. Collins podcast, and he has seen the new flick Official Secrets. Here's his review.
Gavin Hood's new movie is a hot potato. Official Secrets is about the commencement of the Iraq War. But since the conflict began way back in March of 2003, the film is now only a tepid potato. The passing of 16 years isn't a short stretch. Actually, it's just slightly longer than when the late journalist Gary Webb's life started going afoul after his sustained efforts reporting dark aspects of the Nicaraguan War under Reagan. Recall the 2014 movie Kill the Messenger? Modesto's own Jeremy Renner played Webb. Secrets is a caper about the hassle occurring in the lead-up to the U.S. invasion of old Saddam's oily but sandy acres. It's set in London among analysts at the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, also with British newspaper journalists and a few clever legal eagles who speak with an English accent. Keira Knightley plays real person Catherine Gunn. She works as a translator at GCHQ, a section of Brit Intelligence. The script follows Gunn getting a tip that Britain and the USA are finagling to leverage a few UN member nations to vote aye on whether the United Nations should greenlight the invasion. I recall all that hoopla going on in that mess. You probably do too. Gunn funnels the tip forward that's finally picked up by Martin Bright, a London Observer reporter. All hell breaks loose at the editor's desk, as the Observer has already come out for the invasion. Good drama coming from those moments. The paper finally publishes what's going on with Tony Blair and the George W. Bush administration. Then all hell really breaks loose. Gunn, following many sleepless nights, comes forward and confesses her action. She knew, doubtlessly, the information being sloshed about WMD and poison gas secreted in Iraq is lots of Blair-Bush BS. She indicates, when charged with the breaking of the Official Secrets Act, that she doesn't work for the British government, but for the people of Britain. It's one of those nice moments that might make Americans want to reflect on what politicians are elected to do in Britain and the United States of America. Government detectives swoop in on Gunn, arresting her immediately but releasing her to go home and remain with her husband until decisions are made whether or not she'll be charged. It looks grim, and so are the looks on the faces of the folks that follow her constantly. Charges are leveled against Gunn. Then the lawyering comes into play. A man named Ben Emerson, played by Ralph Fiennes, takes her case. He's rough, edgy, and totally rational, and that is a different kind of guy, huh? He finds a bit of a loose end in the legalities of Gunn's predicament that might keep her out of jail or receive a light sentence. You can surf around to find out about that part of this true story, but I won't say what happens after that. After some low-level goofs that occur at Emerson's office, all American news networks and journals back out on the following up of the initial Observer story. They're not inclined to touch this hot potato of a story with a 10-foot table fork. Should you do research of your own regarding the upshot of this sizzler, you'll discover that only one American media cable TV program that I know of reported specifics about the story as it was occurring. It was Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. Most of us recall how nearly everyone in this nation was lamenting the obviously impending invasion brought on by the prevarications based on weapons of mass destruction, etc. Call her silly, but Catherine Gunn was trying to keep lots of human beings from dying due to falsified reasons. Funny how bold-faced lying, since those early days of 2003, has become so routine, and this normal. For the Peter B. Collins podcast, just inland off the left coast, this is Gary Chu, Valleyed Out in Sacramento.
Thank you, Gary Chu, for your review all the way from Sacramento. I'm definitely going to check out Official Secrets as soon as I can get to the movie theater. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.